Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to the INTP stream. There's a common topic, just to get started. There's a common topic in political discourse in this country, particularly, well, both on the right and the left. This is an issue where, incidentally, this happens to be an issue where the right and the left do tend to agree that it's much better to keep jobs at home, right? We have complex regulations, we have complex taxation law, we have complex policies, regulatory policies in this country. And oftentimes manufacturers and large corporations and businesses looking to make more and more profit, which is their proper motive, want to perhaps outsource, right? To build overseas manufacturing plants so that they can exploit potentially cheaper labor there to avoid wage law here. And to potentially lower their overhead in terms of wages because wage regulations may be different there. Exploit the cheaper labor there to avoid paying, right? To avoid the more expensive labor here. And that's fair. I mean, if I were in some sort of context where the generation of substantial amounts of profit were necessary for my business, then I would certainly consider that if I were a large enough manufacturing company and I had the resources to go overseas and to build, to acquire the property and the resources over there necessary to create such a manufacturing plant so that I could exploit the cheaper labor over there. I think that, these businesses, these US-based businesses, are operating within a particular economy and a particular regulatory landscape. And I really don't think that it's a fair loophole that they just get to say, well, I don't like the wage regulations here. I don't like the wage law here. I don't want to pay that much. I don't want to pay for, I don't want my overhead in terms of my overhead in terms of labor. I don't want that to be that high. So I'm going to go overseas. I'm going to exploit the cheaper labor there. And, sure, it's true. They would be going overseas and creating jobs over there. The problem is, yeah, it does create jobs there, and we lose jobs here. If the jobs were here, that would be much better. We need more jobs. I mean, if we're operating under the conclusion that we need more jobs, we need to work to make sure that we keep them here. That we can't really prevent them from outsourcing in this way. We can't absolutely prevent that. We can't block them from doing something like that. There's no reasonable legal precedent that would allow us to do something like that. And so I like looking at policy as a game of chess, right? And with chess, there's this thing where, you're trying to figure out, trying to predict how your player, is going to move next. And you're trying to predict how he'll predict you'll move and then act to deflect his next move. And so we can't really, with any kind of policy prohibition, any kind of direct we can't just simply block this kind of labor outsourcing. I mean, and building U.S. companies building manufacturing plants overseas that allow them to exploit the cheaper labor over there to avoid the wage regulation here and to avoid the wage law here. It's just not, there's not a clear legal or policy precedent for doing something like that. I mean, in an ideal world, we would be able to do something like that. So the trick with policy is trying to figure out what's the clever sort of indirect way that's to force the economy in a particular direction and to force rational actors in a particular direction without having to create new precedents, something that's backed up loosely by historical precedents. So we're considering a range of dimensions here, right? It needs to be backed up by history. It needs to be backed up by precedent. It also needs to be efficient. We need to do it ethically. I mean, with policy, there are 100 of these different dimensions that you have, not 100. You have a lot of dimensions to consider: efficiency, ethics, economics, precedent, history, law, and statistics, evidence. And so you have a number of things, a number of points, a number of point factors to consider, and that's fine. And And so it's a complex game, and that's the thing that's fun about policy. It's a complex game where you can kind of figure out how to anticipate how rational actors within a particular market are going to act. We impose these wage regulations here. Well, they'll just find a loophole, go overseas, exploit the cheaper wage there, and lower their overhead, potentially even considering the cost of actually going overseas. If in the long term there would be some sort of benefit to overhead in doing that from the short-term cost of going overseas, then they'll do it. Okay, so how do you do this in a cleverly indirect way? What I would suggest is something called an outsourcing agreement. So what you could do is you could create an agreement between the United States and whatever other countries, manufacturers are commonly outsourcing toward, like China or South America. You create something I would call outsourcing agreements with these countries. International agreements between countries are common, relating to economic regulation and 100 of other procedural issues. I think there's probably sound precedent for creating something like this, even if it isn't the most. We're not simply employing a previously existing piece, we're creating a whole new piece. So if we're using the analogy to chess, now an outsourcing agreement, the idea here is, so let's say that, from the US-based companies are really outsourcing a lot for labor to China, creating manufacturing plants over there to exploit the cheap labor force there to avoid the high cost of wages here. You can create an outsourcing agreement between China and the US. And this agreement is that when US-based companies do go over there and license themselves to exploit the labor over there and build manufacturing plants, those companies are bound to the same wage law that exists in the United States, right? So whatever the relevant minimum wage would be, those companies would have to pay, outsourcing to these other countries, would have to pay the proportional wage in whatever currency is over there, the equivalent wage in whatever currency is over there to the workers over there. Now, why is that a smart move? I think it's a smart move because why are companies outsourcing their jobs? It's because it's cheaper to do that, right? So if they're doing it because it's cheaper, right? If it's cheaper to exploit the labor force over there, rather than paying at levels under the wage regulations here to workers here to keep the jobs here, right? Well, the incentive for them to go overseas is because it's cheaper. Okay, so remove that incentive by making it equally expensive, if not more expensive. Indirectly increase the cost of going overseas. How do you do that? You create outsourcing agreements between, let's say in this concrete example, the US and China. When these US-based companies go over to exploit the labor, they have to pay the equivalent wage to the workers that would be over there. They would pay over there as they would pay over here in whatever currency exists over there. In China, I think it's like rubles or something like that. The concrete details of this specific example are irrelevant. The key is, in doing that, right, now these companies that would outsource have to pay the same amount for wages over there. And if they have to pay the same amount for wages over there, then there's no benefit to them from go over there, right? There's no benefit to them to go over there if they have to still pay the same amount in wages. And then with these outsourcing agreements, companies that would outsource to these countries to exploit cheap labor forces, right, would have to pay this, essentially, that would be bound to the same wage regulations that exist in the US by creating international outsourcing agreements between these international entities like the US and China. If these US-based companies come over here, they license themselves to manufacture, they build manufacturing plants, they go through that process, right? They are bound to paying, right, for whatever the relevant minimum wage is, they are bound to pay at the same minimum, right? The same minimum wage over there in the equivalent, proportionally, in whatever currency exists over there. And what this would do is, so then these companies would be like, well, okay, I was going to outsource because then I'd be able to save money. I could exploit a cheaper labor force. I could avoid wage law here, exploit the wage law there, and exploit the working class there, the workforce there, to save money on overhead for wages. I could make more profit. But in this case, if you have these agreements between these two countries that bind these US companies to the same wage law over there as they would be bound to over here, then there's no financial benefit for them to go overseas. Because then not only do they have to pay the short-term cost of going overseas, that's added to the same amount, right? That's added to the amount that they would have to pay in wages, right? And the addition of the cost of going overseas would then make the whole enterprise unprofitable. And that's how, and if we can, through these international outsourcing agreements between these international entities and countries, if we could create these effectively, we could incentivize businesses that would outsource to keep their jobs here, because then there's no financial benefit, right, to going overseas. It would be the same cost for wages in the equivalent currency added to the cost of going overseas. The way that you incentivize businesses to do certain things is you manipulate markets and you manipulate costs for them to push them in a given direction in an indirect fashion, so that you don't have to violate precedent or history. In this way, I think I'm simply moving a bishop, right, into a particular position. It's not decisive, because this all rests upon the idea that we would be able to create these international outsourcing agreements between manufacturing and outsourcing agreements between countries. But let's say that we could assume that we can do that. Let's say that we can do that. Let's assume that we can do that. Okay, fine. And so, and then, even if they still decide to outsource, these companies in the US still decide to outsource labor for other reasons, that's fine, right? They bring jobs to the foreign market. They bring wealth and prosperity to all those that would be paid the equivalent wage, right? The equivalent minimum in that country as it would be in this country. And so it's ultimately a benefit for the foreign market. But if there's no financial benefit, companies are rational actors. If there's no motivated by the desire for profit, if there's no profit in that and only loss, they're not going to do it. They're not going to do it. And so that would encourage them. Then you deflect their outsourcing, their attempt to outsource, and you keep the jobs in the US market, because then if you can establish these agreements, going overseas wouldn't result in any reduction in overhead and thus an increase in profit, right? So then you force them, right? Just with that swift chess move, you keep them inside the US. You keep these jobs inside the US, these manufacturing jobs, and that increases the number of the relevant type of job in the US. And I think that ultimately improves the job market. It lowers, if we have this vacuum of a bunch of other jobs, we've eliminated, through this manipulation of financial incentives, we've prevented outsourcing, increases jobs in the States. Okay, now we've got this vacuum, we've got all this supply of jobs, and I think that would naturally lower unemployment, because the unemployed are then sifted into these, they're then moved into these positions, into these jobs, and then that lowers unemployment. So I think that in this country, what we need to do is to lower unemployment, right? We need to increase the supply of jobs, and to increase the supply of jobs, we need to prevent, inside the United States, we need to prevent outsourcing of labor to other countries. That increases the supply of jobs in the States, and hence it decreases unemployment. And I think that this is a pretty good proposal. I've never heard it proposed before, so it's a bit of an innovation, I think, on my part. And hopefully it's a good idea. I'm fully willing to take someone more educated in policy and economics, fully willing to take criticisms on that point. I'm just kind of spitballing here with the knowledge I do have. Hopefully this was enjoyable. And hopefully my proposition was made clear and coherent. Thank you for watching.